Hello. Welcome to Point of View. Today we will talk about the global brainwashed by America. Global brainwashed zombies, made in USA. Quoting from Rebel Voice blog. Those of us in the West have a fairly biased opinion of the USA and its form of government. We are inundated with what is endless propaganda, telling us how we should view that portion of North America. But is it accurate? Hollywood and the wider entertainment industry serve as tools in weaving the American myth. The USA influences many countries in the world, with economic, political and military means. Then, using brainwashing propaganda machines, to indoctrinate oblivious victims and turning them into zombies made in the USA. What is the meaning of Zomtusa? The brain-dead followers of the whims and fantasies of anything American. Acronym for zombies made in the USA.
How many Americans know that Donald Trump is the president of Guam? We all grow up learning the official origin story and history of the United States. What we never learn is what this country really is: the greater United States. This is the subject of a new book by historian Daniel Emervar, How to Hide an Empire: A History of the Greater United States. At a time when reckoning with our history is more urgent than ever, Professor Emervar lays out, through years of research, the true size of the American empire, how it acquired other nations and hundreds of islands as territories it still controls today, and how whiteness drew the borders of all 50 states. As the title reflects, this reality is completely hidden to those of us living on the mainland, and whatever the empire wants hidden should always be brought to light. So when we first started Empire Files a couple of years ago, we were hesitant to use the word empire because it wasn't really in the mainstream lexicon at the time. And that's why it's so incredible to see your book come out, How to Hide an Empire, Daniel. Through all your extensive research, why don't we start off by talking about what makes you quantify the US as an empire?
So there are a couple things that we can mean when we say empire. Empire is often used as a pejorative, and I think that's why it becomes such a contentious term. To say that the United States is an empire is to disapprove of it. But empire is also a technical term. Empire is a way of referring to polities that have colonies and outposts. And in that technical sense, the United States has unambiguously been an empire. It's had overseas territories. In fact, it still has overseas territories today, and it has some 800 military bases that it has secure access to. So in that sense, just in the mere territorial sense, it's pretty indisputable. The United States is an empire.
Absolutely. You talk about two different maps of the United States, the logo map, which I love, and the map of the greater United States. Can you explain this difference?
Yeah, so I think when you ask most people in the United States to call to mind what they think that country looks like, they usually imagine the familiar shape. You can probably call it to mind yourself. It's the contiguous blob. Canada's on the north, Mexico's in the south. There are oceans on either side. And the thing is that that familiar mental map corresponds accurately to the borders of the country for 3 years. So there are 3 years of US history where that's actually what the country looks like. Partly because at the start of US history, in the 18th century and going into the 19th century, the United States expanded through a series of purchases, conquests, and dispossessions of indigenous people, but also because after the United States filled out that familiar silhouette, in fact, 3 years after it did that, it started expanding overseas, and we don't always talk as much about that part. It started claiming uninhabited territory islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean. It claimed inhabited Alaska. In 1867, by the end of the 19th century, the United States had a really large and populous overseas empire. It had colonies.
And all of these territories don't really make up that much space, Daniel. Why are they so important to understand the true history of the United States?
Well, it depends. If you look at the United States at the heyday of its territorial empire, right before World War II, and you mashed all the territories together, you'd actually have quite a lot of the country. There's a lot of space outside of the United States, Alaska being the most obvious example of that, but the Philippines also is huge. And I think it might be tempting to sort of round all those islands and military bases down to zero, but what my research showed is that'd be a terrible idea, because even small spaces, even a military base in the middle of a country, that can be really important. And in fact, these spaces, these parts of the United States outside of the mainland, have consistently been on the front lines of its history. And I don't think you can really understand US history unless you've got these places in view.
Before we get into this expansion outside of our logo map, let's talk about how the 50 states of the United States were captured in a very similar way to these island territories that nobody knows about. You say in your book that this massive expanse that was called, Indian Territory was really the first U.S. colony, and how that and the Louisiana Purchase defined a kind of this notion of what you called a cross-continental apartheid.
So one thing that's really important to get about the early U.S. history is how important Native American polities are to it. They are not easily displaced, and in fact, the leaders of the early republic spend a lot of time thinking about how to deal with the fact that they are ruling over a territory that they don't really have full control over, because a lot of the land still remains under native title. And so one thing that Jefferson and those following in his footsteps try to do is they try to deal with North America, or the portion of it that's the United States, by implementing a sort of continent-scale apartheid. So Jefferson's vision, and this is what he wants to do with the Louisiana Purchase, is to use all that land claimed in the Louisiana Purchase, to use almost all of it for Native Americans. And the idea would be that the eastern part of the United States, east of the Appalachians, that part would be reserved largely for white settlers and their black slaves. And then the western part, that would be nearly all Native American lands. And in the 1830s, the United States actually did carve up a huge part of the United States into what it called Indian country. This was land that was supposed to be lived in only by Native Americans. White people without passes weren't even allowed to go there. And at the moment it was carved out of the country, Indian country accounted for 46% of the land area of the United States. So very arguably, that's the first colony that the United States ever had, a colony in the real sense. However, it didn't last very long. Indian country was a sort of fragile presence on the map, and it was quickly whittled down as more and more areas were bitten out of it and white settlers poured in until it became what is now the state of Oklahoma.
And today, the US has more military bases in foreign nations than just about all other countries combined, approximately 800. It is engaged in more wars than any other 5 nations combined. It spends more on its military than any 2 other nations combined. It has a secret police known as Homeland Security, a right-wing political system, legislation that grants virtually unlimited domestic power to the government, Patriot Act. Legislation that allows the military to attack the International Criminal Court to free US criminals, convicted or otherwise. US is the only nation on Earth known to have such legislation. It has a concentration camp in illegally occupied Cuba, known as Camp X-Ray, in Guantanamo, is the only nation to have used nuclear weapons to kill, maintains a huge chemical and biological weapons ability, oppresses and marginalizes its own people, conducted both ethnic cleansing and genocide against various indigenous peoples of the now US. Stole land from Mexico, colonized Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, part of Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands and US Virgin Islands, enforces the rights of its capitalist corporations to strip countries of their resources, sells more weapons than any other 3 nations combined, has created more terrorist groups, armed and directed them than any other 10 nations combined. It installs and supports dictatorships such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, UAE, Myanmar, has toppled democratically elected governments such as Honduras, Nicaragua, Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, Egypt, and Ukraine, and gives tacit and unquestioning support to the rogue state of Israel that is also itself engaged in ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. The US is also in breach of scores of UN resolutions, including an illegal blockade of Cuba that is decades old, and ignores international norms such as the Geneva Convention of Human Rights. Quite a record, slightly more than 3 strikes and you're
Allegations of sexual misconduct against Harvey Weinstein.
Watch any big-budget war movie, or take in a spy thriller, and you could walk away not knowing just how much your movie experience was shaped by the Pentagon or CIA. However, a trove of official documents obtained under US Freedom of Information laws and published this year detail the dealings between filmmakers and intelligence officials at Langley, Virginia, the CIA headquarters.
Probably the best known are Zero Dark 30 and Argo, but they've also assisted the television show Homeland.
How do we deal with homegrown, violent jihadists?
They've also assisted Alias.
You work for the very enemy you thought you were fighting.
24.
Tell me where the device is!
A CBS series called The Agency.
Then he slit his throat.
They assisted a film called The Sum of All Fears, starring Ben Affleck.
Captain Jack Ryan, CIA. Charlie Wilson's War is a really good example where they maintain the idea that, are we really doing the right thing by arming the Mujahideen, the forerunners of the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization in Afghanistan in the 1980s? They kind of question that in a kind of jokey way. Like the last caption in the film Charlie Wilson's War is something like, we came, we saw, but then we mucked up the end game, or some joke, It's like, no, that's not what you did actually, and you know it because the original script and the original book that you base this on doesn't say that. You armed terrorists in a really horrific conflict. It's the whole organization behind it, at a systematic level. And that turned Charlie Wilson's War into this saccharine, benign movie.
Throughout the 1990s, the CIA worked with Hollywood very specifically on movies that portrayed the CIA as sort of a heroic force protecting America. Most of the movies were based on Tom Clancy books, actually. So you had A Hunt for Red October and that entire franchise. The lead character, Jack Ryan, is this like super heroic figure, and he's like constantly taking down bad guys and saving America, saving the world from various threats, whether it's Islamic terrorism or the IRA or ultimately white supremacists.
Between them, the CIA and the US Department of Defense have had varying levels of input, from simply clarifying points for authenticity to actually writing parts of scripts on more than 1,800 movies and TV shows. When it comes to influencing filmmakers, shaping the story, the Pentagon is usually in a stronger negotiating position than the CIA. Because of the hardware at its disposal, it can shut down a movie before a scene is ever shot.
The Department of Defense is actually a much more powerful player in the entertainment industry for basically financial reasons. The Department of Defense has expensive toys. They have submarines, they have aircraft carriers, they have tanks, and they have the personnel to operate each of those things. So if a filmmaker wants to make a war movie, they often will approach the Department of Defense and basically ask to borrow that equipment. And the Department of Defense will say, maybe, but can I see your script? And they will either say, this is great, we love the way that the military is portrayed in this, we will go ahead and collaborate with you. Or they may say, we hate the way that we're portrayed and refuse to participate.
When the Pentagon does agree to support a film, there can be some scripting strings attached. And the Vietnam War is clearly a sore point. In The Hulk, a reference to a US operation that poisoned Vietnamese farmland was removed. And in the Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies, a suggestion that the US did not win the war was cut out. In Iron Man, a reference to soldier suicides was removed, again at the Pentagon's insistence. The CIA's presence in Hollywood is harder to detect. It goes back to the early days of the Cold War and was designed to counter a propaganda effort coming out of the Soviet Union. The CIA placed undercover agents in major studios where they monitored left-wing screenwriters and directors. This was at the height of Cold War paranoia, and Hollywood
the US influences traveled to the other side of the world, the Asia-Pacific region, complementing the many US military bases, all the distance, thousands of miles. They have strong relationship the USA, to much extent Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, the Philippines, India, and Taiwan. The American brainwashing machines come in many forms: fast food chain, Hollywood movies, computer games, TV series, fashions, music and songs, sports, basketball league, baseball games, social media, news media, just to name a few.
We have come to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Let us know the videos you like and leave your comment below. We have regular videos, so be sure to hit the red button below.